Do you remember what was going on 25 years ago? We've all forgotten about Y2K, but for a time, the world was curious as to whether we were going back to the dark ages or not. When they started programming computers, they only used 2 digits for the year, which was fine until we got to the year 2000, and we had no idea if all of the world's computers were going to suddenly stop working. Maybe in some ways we would have been better off. It turned out not to be that big of a deal. The financial system didn't collapse. The power grid didn't stop working. Largely, probably thanks to the frantic preparation that was done months in advance. But there was this time of incredible unease, and it was filled with uncertainty, and it was filled with fear. And so fast forward to 2025, and I don't think it's a huge stretch to say the world continues to have unease. There continues to be uncertainty. There continues to be fear. If you don't have any, please tell the rest of us how to get to that blessed state. Right after the Rose Parade, I spent an hour watching the news with updates on the horror in New Orleans. In the midst of a celebratory occasion, violence entered in and it tore lives apart. And it reminds us that despite the light, despite the hope, despite the celebrations, there's always darkness nearby threatening. And in the midst of such a world, we need real light. We need substantial light to guide our hearts, to keep us hoping. Think for a moment about the things that give you hope, the things that keep you going when you're confronted with real fear, with uncertainty. We need something substantial to hold on to. Small things don't help us in those critical moments as much as we need. We need something big, and that's the message of Epiphany, the light of Christ revealed in a world desperate for hope. As we look at the story of the wise men in Matthew 2, we see aspects of their journey that help us think about the root cause of our own hope. As we talked about the shepherds last week, the wise men, the magi, were not the people you'd expect to be some of the first ones to greet Jesus. They were Gentiles. They were outsiders from the East. They were scholars who looked to the stars, these astrologers. Unlikely that they were specifically looking for a Jewish Messiah. They saw something divine, and it sparked a curiosity in them. And that curiosity was so great that it inspired them to take this incredible journey. And they were fulfilling this Old Testament prophecy, but we don't know if they were aware of it or not. Numbers 24 references a star rising out of Jacob, and it's wild to read Isaiah 60 about nations and kings coming to a rising light and bringing gifts, including gold. Something extraordinary was happening, and they were part of it. In the midst of uncertain times, this fulfillment of centuries-old prophecies is occurring, and its reaches beyond, far beyond the Jewish tribes. It's to the whole world, showing us once more that to put our hope in God is not to hope in a small God who can only solve small problems, but rather, when we hope in God, we are putting our hope in a God of the whole world, whose reach and power extend far beyond what we can comprehend. We need a big God who can solve big problems. And time again, that's exactly what God shows that God is capable of. And it's fascinating when the Magi show up in Jerusalem, what happens and what doesn't happen. They ask where the child is, the one that is born king of the Jews, and Herod is immediately put off because he thinks of himself as the king over the Jews. Matthew tells us that Herod is troubled and all Jerusalem with him. Herod has worldly power, and he's gonna fight. He's gonna close his fist tightly around that, like a child at the risk of losing a toy to a rival. Do you know people like that? People who hold tightly to things when they're at risk of losing them. It's driven by fear. They're terrified of the thought of losing that power. And it creates uncertainty in others who then don't know how to react. And what's interesting is next, so Herod summons the chief priests and the scribes. These are the religious leaders, the ones who should be most tuned in to what God is doing. They know the scriptures, for they point Herod and wise men to Bethlehem. They don't seem to have any interest in going to see for themselves. They're indifferent. They have head knowledge, but their hearts have apathy. Do they care if the Messiah has arrived? It's 5 miles from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. They could walk it in 2 hours. but they can't be bothered. The wise men have traveled hundreds of miles at great personal expense to see the Messiah, but the chief priests and the scribes aren't willing to give up an afternoon. Both have head knowledge that God is likely doing something remarkable, but only one group lets that impact their lives, to change their schedules, to inconvenience them. It shows us that simply knowing God or knowing about God doesn't change our lives. Only when we open our hearts and submit ourselves to God, only then do we discover knowledge that changes lives. Do we build a relationship? And then we discover what it means to rejoice exceedingly with great joy. Just think about it. The chief priests and the scribes, they were 5 miles away from being able to rejoice exceedingly with great joy, but they missed it. They didn't follow where God was leading. How far would you go? If I told you that you had the chance to rejoice exceedingly with great joy, with cosmic joy, how far would you travel? The Magi took the chance. They followed the star to Jesus, and the wise men think they had the wealth and the resources to uproot their lives, to travel for hundreds of miles, to follow a star. They didn't need to travel, and right, they had substantial wealth, so they had success in their lives. But in that dusty stable, they found something greater. They found great joy, a joy they couldn't find anywhere else. They knelt before this child. They offer their gifts. They worship. They bring gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Gold for a king. Frankincense is for God, recognizing God's authority overall, recognizing God's divinity, the divinity of Jesus. And the myrrh foreshadows Jesus' death, his sacrifice. So the wise men in their worship, they affirm Jesus' role as king, as God and Savior. Do we approach Jesus with the same reverence and awe? And think about it. We know what the Magi knew, and we know the rest as well. We know how the child will grow into a man who will show us the fullness of God's power and God's love. Even more than the Magi, we should be willing to follow wherever the light may lead. Even more than the Magi, we should be willing to pour out our gifts, to set down our treasure in worship of Jesus. The chief priests and the scribes, they were too deep in their routines to change anything to see Jesus, despite their deep head knowledge of the scriptures. May we be careful to not do likewise. The Magi let their knowledge impact their lives and change their actions. So where does it leave us? Like the Magi, we are in uncertain times, but we know there is light and hope out there because we know Jesus' death and resurrection, his power transforms things. We know the rest of the story. The Magi, they didn't know when they set out on their journey. They didn't know every step of it. They had to stop and ask directions. There was incomplete knowledge, but they knew enough to get started. They knew enough to take the next step. They knew to come and kneel and surrender before the manger. Herod had the same knowledge, but he clung to power out of fear. And I think about how we face a daily choice in what kind of life we want to lead. One that surrenders in hope and in faith, or one that clings to what we have in fear. Our choices aren't as stark as they are here in Matthew 2, but they're just as important. I don't know about you, but when I read or watch the news, there's something that happens in my heart that makes me react in fear. Like Herod, I worry about losing what is mine here in our part of town. Like in many communities, there's rampant car theft. Every time I turn around, there's news stories about cars being broken into, about cars being stolen, and I worry. It's natural to worry in light of these things. It's human. But the thing that I notice is my heart starts to look at the world as a place that is growing worse by the day. The crime we see, not just in New Orleans, but here in our own city, I look at it and I think that the world is getting darker. And it makes me afraid. But Scripture paints a different picture because there is Epiphany light that has come into the world. The prologue to John's Gospel tells us that light shines in the darkness shall not overcome it. So here's our challenge for 2025. Make time every day to look for that light, to be intentional about reminding ourselves that the darkness shall not overcome the light. Look for hope. Some days it takes a lot of work. We know this, but let's do the work when we're overcome with uncertainty and fear, rather than be like Herod and shrink back in fear, or like the chief priests who opt for indifference so that their routine is not disturbed. Find a way, like the Magi, to gather around the manger in hope, to keep journeying, to keep pressing forward, because you believe that it's worth the journey to see the light, to see the hope. Think about what can be a touchstone for you when you notice yourself retreating in the face of darkness, when you feel that shadow casting itself over your heart. Find a psalm, find a prayer that helps you be hopeful, that thinks about the rest of the story, about the power of the resurrection, about God entering into our lives and giving that to us as a free gift. That our hope depends not on what we do, not on what the world does, but on what Jesus has done, on what he has accomplished. Think of Christ's church. Think of our congregation. Think of everything that we've been through over the years, and we're still here. We're still worshiping together. There are people that love you, that care for you. Call them, text them, pray for them. Ask them to pray for you. They will. Everybody in this church has a deacon that is praying for them. To hold on to that hope, to look at the light. I am amazed at how we care for one another here. Let the community remind you to be hopeful. It matters. It shapes how we view the world, and it shapes how we view each other, and it shapes how our faith helps us interact one with another. Jesus came into the world to give us hope. In the darkest hour of his life, when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, he went to God in prayer and found the strength to continue on his journey. May we do the same. Finding hope in dark times, finding light to guide us. The gospel is a free gift. And it shows us how Christ conquers sin and darkness through his power, and he will gather the world to himself. Like the Magi, may we stay faithful, continue on the journey, taking the next step in faith and in hope.